Thank you for joining us for this continued series of interviews sponsored by the Logan Tabernacle Concert and Lecture Series Committee and the Cache Community Connections. I'm Carol Fote, and I'm your host. Our guest today is Darren Parry, a familiar face and a familiar name in Cache Valley. And I've asked Darren to share what life is like for him in his earlier years as a Shoshone Native American. Darren, thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Carol. I'm excited to talk about something so important to me.
Thank you. Okay, let's start out with going back to the beginning of time. That is your time. And tell us about your parents, your family, your siblings, where you grew up. Give us a little bit of that history.
I'd love to. I love talking about my family. They're wonderful people. And so my dad was Bruce Parry. My mother was Darlene Sessions. My dad was born and raised at Washakie, Utah. It was a small Indian community north of Tremonton. It was established in 1878 for the Shoshone people. They taught us to farm. But my dad was born and raised there. When he was 12, my grandparents moved the family to Clearfield. Their next door neighbor was a young girl named Darlene Sessions, my mother, and they got to be good friends at an early age. And so ended up getting married. They went to Davis High School together. He played sports. She just watched. And so they ended up getting married, and I was their first of 4 children. So my dad, though, was an educator. He got his teaching degree from the University of Utah, where he had a full ride scholarship to play baseball. He was a pitcher. And he got his degree to teach, and he wanted to coach. So my whole life, I had the early years especially, my dad was a high school football and basketball coach. And so I grew up in the gymnasium, so to speak. And he had 4 children. I'm the oldest I have 3 other siblings, and there's myself and 2 sisters. They're only 10 months apart, and then a younger brother. So there's 8 years between myself and my brother. But we had a wonderful childhood. After I turned about 15, my dad took a job with the state of Utah. He was named the director of Indian Affairs for the state of Utah. So he was in charge of all of the Indian tribes in Utah. So from that point on, I got to know a different side of my dad. Instead of coaching, I'd often go with him to the different Indian reservations around the state, meet with leaders from all different tribes. And so that immersed me back into my culture again. And he was that for more than 20 years. And he ended up retiring in state government from that. So, yeah, wonderful childhood.
So, Darren, we have a list of questions here, but usually we always go off the track. When you bring something up, then it sparks an idea. So were you said that you had to kind of get immersed back into your culture after your dad took that job as a head of the Indian Affairs. So did you consider yourself as a Shoshone as you were growing up in your younger years?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's always something that the way I identified myself. And my grandmother would always talk to journalists at her home, and she would say, because my grandmother married a white man, my father was half. And so my father married a white woman, and that made me a quarter. Mm-hmm. So I'm a quarter Shoshone, and 3/4 of me is Welsh and English. But I've always identified as Native American, and my grandmother told journalists all the time, with me sitting there, go ask him what he is. And I would always say that I'm an Indian. Oh. So that's how I always looked at myself as, I feel bad for my English and Welsh family, because I suppress that side. I never want to identify with them, even though they were wonderful people. I just thought it was cooler to be an Indian.
So because of that, you identifying yourself as an Indian, did that cause any issues for you? Where people kind of put up a wall because they looked at you as an Indian rather than as a white man?
Not really. Especially growing up, my friends thought it was the coolest thing ever. They always, wish we were Indians, and my friends went to my grandparents all the time. My grandparents lived right across the street from the high school I attended, so oftentimes during lunch we'd run over and see my grandmother. But it didn't cause any trouble at all for me growing up. I never felt like I was different, even though a lot of Native American children are looked at as different. For me, it was always a sense of pride and something that my friends thought was cool and the school thought was cool. But look, I identify as an American, but I have lived, Carol, a very privileged life. I grew up in a wonderful home with loving parents, had all the schools available to me, Clearfield High School, and then went on from there. I served an LDS mission, came back from my mission and attended the University of Utah for 3 years. And then a scholarship I was on ran out. And so I ended finishing my degree at Weber State University and got a degree in secondary education. I wanted to follow in my dad's footsteps. I wanted to be a coach and teach high school. And so, yeah, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Although I have never taught a day in a high school or a junior high. But I teach every day almost, but it's not in that setting.
Sure. So I know that you spent a lot of time with your grandmother. What influence did she have on you?
Oh, do you have 6 hours? So she was the most wonderful woman that I'd ever met. I mean, the influence she had on me, she just taught me gentleness and kindness and a sense of respect for people. In my book, I tell a story about her always having a pot of stew on the stove to feed those who would come to her home. She never let anybody that come to her home leave without feeding them. And so I just learned a sense of how important her community was and how important it is to embrace who your people are. And then always look out for the marginalized, those people that have never had a voice before, because growing up as a young Shoshone girl and going to boarding school, and she never had a voice. Her group was always one that was marginalized. But she never made me feel that way. And I've never felt that way growing up in my school setting like she did. So her ability to forgive and just reconcile the past and live a life that was as a storyteller and one who brought people together, that's resonated with me more than anything else she could have taught me.
Sure. So, Darren, you indicated that you lived a privileged life, but you have seen from the inside how some of your people have been treated. Have you been able to encourage them to step out of that suppression?
Yes. In fact, I always tell people that, our tribe's story is different from other tribes. Most tribes that live on a reservation have a very different world experience than I have had. And so, when our tribe all joined the LDS Church in 1873, that led us down a little different path. We assimilated into the cultures. That's why I feel like, we're your neighbors. We've grown up with normal other people. And so, but I'm conscious of the fact that that's not the experience that most of my Native brothers and sisters have had, where they're on a reservation, a lot of times out in rural communities, far away. They've never had internet. They have very few goods and services available. Some of my Navajo brothers and sisters don't even have running water or electricity. So I'm so conscious of the fact that my experience isn't their experience. And I really try to provide that empathy when when talking about my experience, and really the key for all of it, even now, even in those um, reservation settings they live in today, the key is education. I've always felt like if we can educate our kids, even if you're in a reservation setting, give them the opportunity to go to school and go to university or a trade school, they're going to be better equipped to handle this changing world that we live in. So uh, I try not to project my experience on them because really they don't know what that's like.
Mhm.
But having used my experience, I think I can offer a perspective that without judging or without putting my moral values on them, to just give them an avenue that they can take themselves and really make a difference in their own lives. And so, we all have the ability to change our circumstances sometimes, and sometimes it's easier for some groups than others. But I always preach education. If we can get those kids to be educated and somehow provide them with a way to expand beyond the reservation system, then I think they're going to have a real chance
Sure.
at a wonderful life, better than what they've had.
Sure. So, Darren, how do you see changes in the world today? Do you feel that people are marginalized people are given more of a chance, less of a chance? Are we sliding backwards? What do you think about that?
That's a great question. Uh, I mean, maybe a couple of years ago, I was thinking we were making progress, and we're getting to a place that we can see things changing for the better, I think. But man, turn on the TV and where we've gone lately, and uh, we almost seem as divided as ever, and we're divided into different camps. And so, man, I always have hope for the future. I'll always hold out that hope that we're going to do better. But the last year has taught me that we're all going to have to work really hard to get there. And so I still think there's hope for all of us. I still think my communities can make it. And but man, if I think we'd all have a better chance if we'd all turn off the news and just go love our neighbor. Because I think most of us, in our personal experiences in the communities that we live in, have had wonderful experiences. We have a good life. We really do here in the Cache Valley. And so I think what gets us down sometimes is turning on the national news and seeing some of the divisive things that people are going through. But I think as it gets closer to home, I think those relationships and what we're doing is so much better. But I'm always going to have hope for the future. I just always felt like if we all do our part and try to make a difference, then we can affect change. And I hold that out for our community and the Native American community as well.
Sure. It's interesting now that you brought up to love your neighbor. And how can we, I was going to ask you, how can we get there from here? And you kind of covered it, but what can we do from where we're at to be better neighbors and to understand each other, connect with each other?
I had a really quickly, I had an experience a couple of years ago down in the Attorney General's office. I was there for a meeting and I got there early. I got invited into his office and I stood at the back, and while he was greeting 10 Afghan governors from Afghanistan. And so immediately my mind goes to, oh my gosh, everything I have heard negative about Afghanistan and the conflict there. But as I watched, and then the Attorney General saw me standing back there, and through an interpreter, he said to the governors, would you guys like to meet a real Native American chief? So I'm like mortified that I'm going to have to go up there, and they all nodded yes. And so I went up there and met these 10 governors who looked different than me. Their dress was different. Everything that I'd seen negative on the news was flashing through my brain as I'm greeting them. But I'll tell you what, Carol, that when I took their hand and shook their hand and I was a foot away from their face, all of those fears and things seemed to disappear. And I just saw people that were me and just without the knowledge. And so I just really feel like to be a good nation, to reach out to those in our communities, we really need to get close. We need to go introduce ourselves and just drop down the barriers that we have and not preconceive and judge people for what we've heard from somebody else, and just go start having conversations. As easy as that. And have a conversation and introduce yourself, and then start that conversation from there. But when we listen to people and truly listen, I think we can go a long way to really bettering our communities and being better neighbors.
Absolutely. And that's why we're doing these interviews, because we want people to get to know the people they don't know. And the misconceptions that they have because of somebody that looks different or acts different. And hopefully these interviews can spread throughout the valley. We can get to know our neighbors, and our neighbors being anybody that we come in contact with, that we might live near, that we somehow associate with. They're all our neighbors. And that's what we want to try to get to, is to understand how can we love our neighbor.
Yeah, that's perfect. I love that. And I love this concept of what you're doing. There's so much diversity in this community that we live in, and how rich we would all be if we just take the few minutes every day to get to know somebody different that might look different or talk different. They have wonderful stories and experiences that, frankly, would enrich all of our lives if we knew.
Right.
You will never know unless you try to know.
That's for sure. Right.
Reaching out is the first step of that.
Right. Darren, thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate getting to know you even better.
Thank you very much for having me.
Take care.